For as long as you have existed, you have told stories. You have heard them and passed them on, inherited the stories of others, and written your own. For as long as we have existed, we have been storytellers. Stories are as old as the human race and are, I just want to put this out there, what make us human. The shaping of them, the telling of them, all of these engage and remind us of our common humanity. Stories connect us individually and collectively to what we can look forward to, where our vulnerabilities lie, how we can prevail, how we can flourish. We live in a world that is saturated with stories. Narrative is everywhere. We find it in the full range of creative expression, not only in the written and the oral traditions, but in music and the many visual arts, from painting, performance, and beyond. And it's everything. Or, as the scholar Roland Barthes put it, narrative is simply there, like life itself. But not all stories are the same. What is it about the story of Joseph, locked in painful struggle with his brothers, that draws us in? What is it about the story of Jesus, at his most vulnerable, defending a reviled woman, her tears spilling onto his feet, that engages us in his ultimate grief? What is it about Queen Esther's decisive moment, as she steels herself against the capricious wrath of the Persian king for the sake of the survival of her people, that fires our imagination for our own communities? Or Prometheus, who risked everything to bring fire to humanity, that aligns us with the painful sacrifice of those who have gone before us? Or Sita's commitment to righteousness, that lays bare the personal costs of loyalty and redoubles our commitment to it? Or Sky Woman, in her watchful gratitude, as she sees a world made through an extraordinary collaboration, the self-giving of all the animals, otter, beaver, sturgeon, muskrat, and turtle, who cushion her fall from above. These stories have the long reach, extending from the ancient world to reflect something of the profundity and the timelessness of human experience, encompassing both the strange and the strangely familiar, the fantastical and the enduring. Sacred stories are different because they have the power to hold us, to shape our sense of our own lives, to frame our fears, and inspire our ultimate hopes. And along the way, they make the unseen visible, as Sarah Iles Johnson has observed, bringing us into deeper communion with other worlds, other imaginaries. I am thinking of the story of the god Krishna, incarnate as a little boy, and his mortal foster mother, Yashoda. Krishna has been accused by the other kids of eating dirt, and his foster mother, Yashoda, scolds him for it. In the most human of scenes, a recalcitrant little boy, a firm mother, he denies it and challenges her to see for herself. Mother Yashoda peers into her little boy's mouth, and she saw in his mouth the whole universe, with the far corners of the sky and the wind and lightning and the orb of the earth with its mountains and oceans and the moon and the stars and space itself. And she saw her own village, and she saw herself. The whole world, the whole cosmos in the mouth of this little boy, too wondrous for her to hold in her mind or remember, except that it remains in her love for Krishna when she returns to herself. As Wendy Doniger observed about the power of this sacred story, what could be more personal, more deeply rooted in the things of this world, more literally down to earth or earthy than a small, dirty boy lying about dirt in his mouth? But taking off from this modest moment, the myth plummets down and turns the universe inside out, shifting gears entirely into the warp speed of a myth, a sacred story. Sacred stories do this. They turn our worlds inside and out. The whole world lies inside the tiny mouth of a tiny boy. These all too human, grounded, and earthy moments of sacred stories are always evoking something larger and beyond our reach, visible in only a glimmer. Through stories like these, deeply enmeshed within the world's religious traditions, we perceive in glimpses and find our way. We return to them again and again, making them our own, taking them forward with us, but connecting to the ancient truths of who we are. Or, as Robin Kimmerer writes of the sacred story that animates her imagination, it is so rich and glittering, it feels to me like a deep bowl of celestial blue, from which I could drink again and again. It holds our beliefs, our history, our relationships. Looking into that starry bowl, I see images swirling so fluidly that the past and the present become as one. It speaks not just of where we came from, but also of how we can go forward. I am delighted today to explore the long reach of sacred stories from the past with our three speakers. I, for one, can think of no three that I would rather drink with from the bowl of deep celestial blue. Our first speaker is Dr. Lewis Brogdon, who serves as Associate Professor of Preaching and Black Studies and Director of the Institute for Black Church Studies at the Baptist Seminary of Kentucky. He has served in numerous positions in undergraduate and graduate institutions like Simmons College of Kentucky, Claflin University, Bluefield College, and Louisville Seminary. Dr. Brogdon is also the author of books such as A Companion to Philemon, The Spirituality of Black Preaching, Hope on the Brink, and No Longer a Slave, but a Brother. Brogdon delivers lectures on Martin Luther King Jr., the debate about reparations, and the recent protests about the death of George Floyd. He has developed academic courses on the study of Martin Luther King Jr. for educational institutions in Virginia and Kentucky. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Brogdon.
Good morning. I want to talk this morning about finding hope in hard places. And there is no mistaking we are in some difficult moments and times. In fact, I believe this country is in a fight for its very soul. You saw what unfolded in this nation in 2020 as protests were unleashed all across the country in response to the tragic murders of Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and right here in Louisville over the murder of Breonna Taylor. You saw what happened on the Capitol in January, the beginning of 2021. Following that, continuing attack on voting rights for African Americans, Roe v. Wade has been overturned. The country refuses to change how it teaches history in our public schools, and we even see our workforce disenchanted and refusing to to re-engage our economy. None of this should surprise you because Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. warned America about these very things in 1967 and 68. In a famous sermon he preached on the three great evils of American society, he talked about the evils of racism, poverty, and militarism. In an essay published after his assassination titled "Showdown for Nonviolence," King said these words, and I quote, "White America has allowed itself to be indifferent to race prejudice and economic denial. The urban outbreaks are now a fire bell in the night, clamorously warning that the seams of our entire social order are weakening under the strains of neglect. The American people are infected with racism, and that is the peril." In his final book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, he said these words, "One cannot hope but to keep people locked out of the earthly kingdom of wealth, health, and happiness. Either they share in the blessings of the world, or they organize to break down and overthrow those structures or governments which stand in the way of their goals. This is a treacherous foundation for a world house. Racism can well be the corrosive evil that will bring down the curtain on Western civilization." King warned us about this. And this. And if you look deeper into this moment, I think this moment provides a mirror of sorts to the kind of nation we have become. I think this moment tells us about a real crisis of imagination and the stories we tell ourselves. But if you look deeper, you also see the sacred stories of the Bible being weaponized to exclude, to marginalize, to exploit, and to justify violence against people who are different. I believe in 2008, the most significant event in the 21st century happened, at least in this country, and that was the election of an African American to the highest office in the land. When Obama became the president, forces were unleashed in this country that we are continuing to feel this very day. And what is so sad and also very revealing about what happened in this country ever since those days is you see how religion contorted and distorted itself to justify all the hate, vitriol, and ugliness unleashed onto the landscape of our nation. But if you also look deeper, there are signs of hope. I saw it in the protests where you see masses of white and black Americans demonstrating righteous indignation over the unjust killings of black Americans. Now, sure, you could focus on some windows were broken and some businesses were harmed, but I see signs of hope that people can differentiate right from wrong, and they can call out institutions for their apathy and their silence. And so this morning, I want to speak into the hope that I see, hope that's even evident in seeing so many high school students here in this auditorium on a Thursday morning. And so I come bearing gifts, a gift for my sisters and brothers in the black church, in the black community, a gift for how we engage with the Bible, a text that has a complicated history with our people. I want to share two resources with you. Alan Callahan's book, The Talking Book, great book if you want to examine the history of African American engagement with the Bible. Vincent Wimbush authored a nice, easy read for you, sort of summarizing the history of African Americans and their engagement with Scripture. A couple notable things you'll find is that Black Americans were introduced to the Bible as enslaved persons at the hands of people confessing to be Christians, claiming to organize their faith around the teachings and the stories of the Bible. These resources will also teach you that African Americans use the Bible as a language world, which is why the language of Scripture not only inundates our churches, but pervades culture, in our music, in literature. Echoes of Scripture abound everywhere in the Black community. You'll also find that Americans realize that the Bible can give mixed messages, that this book contains moral contradictions. You know, the same book that says, "Let my people go," is also the same book that says, "Slaves, obey your masters." And so what African Americans did is they made an interesting turn. Instead of discarding the book, they learned how to critically wrestle with the book, wrestle with the stories of the Bible. Because, of course, like so many young people, whether millennials, Gen Z, or the millions of Americans who no longer attend churches, we have a complicated relationship with the sacred text. And so Black people learn to do two things that I want to introduce to you. I think the first thing a lot of people in our culture are kind of good at doing, and that's correcting and exposing when the Bible is being misused or wrongly appropriated. But there is more to the Black tradition than just exposing the misuse of the Bible, but the wonderful ways we learn how to appropriate stories to speak a word of meaning and hope to our existential reality. And this is some of what feeds my work. I want you to keep an eye out this spring for my new book, The Bible in the Ashes of Social Chaos, and then go to the bookstore and buy up my companion to Philemon, and I'll be right at the table waiting to sign it. Because what this work symbolizes is that there's some stories, there's some passages, some text in the Bible that are a bit problematic. The Bible says more than just love your neighbor. It says things like, "Slaves, obey your master." The letter to Philemon was used during the antebellum period to discourage slave flight. In fact, it led to the passing of the Fugitive Slave Act. And in that very letter that was used to disenfranchise our people, I reread that letter in a way that speaks a word of critique and hope. So how do you find hope in hard places, grappling with a text that can send mixed moral messages? My work tries to demonstrate these three things: that you can respect the Bible as a sacred text, while also being honest about things that are being said in there, about killing people, enslaving people, relegating women to subordinate status. You can be honest about that. And then you can go to some of those stories and actually read them in different ways. And so I think at the end of the day, that's the gift that I want to offer to our sisters and brothers who feel a little disenchanted with institutionalized religion. I share their disgust and disenchantment. But as I look deep into culture, I see signs of hope. And I'm writing to those people who have a fundamental sense of right and wrong, and who believes that we can do better than we have done in the past, and want to appropriate stories in a way that helps us to build a better nation. I am looking forward to having conversations about ways we can find hope in these hard places. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Our next speaker, Anam Thubten, grew up in Tibet and at an early age began to practice in the Nyingma lineage of Tibetan Buddhism. He currently resides in the San Francisco Bay Area, where he has not learned to surf, he just told us. He is the founder and spiritual advisor of Dharmata Foundation, teaching widely in the US, Europe, and Asia. And he is the author of several books, including Embracing Each Moment, No Self, No Problem, and The Citadel of Awareness. Through sharing his wisdom and personal experience on the spiritual path, Thubten brings alive the timeless teachings of Buddhism. Join me in welcoming Anam Thubten.
Buddhism has a whole abundance of stories, parables. These stories are, of course, intrinsically sacred, but they are also timeless. And therefore, whether you identify yourself as religious or spiritual or secular, you can learn these sacred Buddhist stories and to apply them in your everyday life as a source of equanimity, courage, hope, compassion, and empowerment. In other words, you don't have to be a Buddhist to get benefit from learning and contemplating those stories. I grew up in Tibet, a culture that is full of stories. Tibet is a country that has a long history. Actually, Tibet had an empire one time, which we don't hear so much. We often hear about the Mongol Empire, Manchu Empire, but there was a Tibetan Empire. It is said that in our historical books that for a long time, the Tibet was governed by three principles: shamanism, riddles, and the stories, until they developed a written language. The Tibetan kings and also queens actually used stories to give guidance to their citizens. It's a way to communicate with each other. And I also grew up in Tibet when Tibet was very much a different world. We didn't have lots of entertainment, no TVs, hardly anybody read books in my family. But my grandparents who raised me share always stories every day, same story all the time, and we never got bored with that. Literally, they tell the same story maybe 300 times a year. Maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit. It was entertainment for us because we didn't have TVs. And also, those stories, to me, give a foundation for me and for everybody to develop our idea of a value system, right and wrong, and also moral principles. And just like that, stories can be really wonderful. They can make you sometimes cry. They can make you sometimes laugh. But also they told me lots of ghost stories too. That's another story, maybe not so sacred. I remember that I had a hard time to go out at night after they told me lots of ghost stories. Anyway, Buddhism also uses sacred stories to feel this deep connection with what they call Dharma, the spiritual path to the enlightenment. The Dharma begins by taking refuge in the Buddhist version of eternity, which is called the three jewels, Buddha, Dharma, and the Sangha. But the question is, what is Buddha? Is Buddha singular or plural? That's a whole philosophical debate, which we will not get into. But Buddha is not really plural. Buddha is not singular either. But when we say Buddha, it does not refer to Shakyamuni Buddha. It refers to the Buddha, the unborn Buddha, lies in each of us. The inherent goodness that lies in each of us. Something maybe Thomas Merton witnessed on the 4th Street. Every time when I come to Louisville, I hope I'm pronouncing your city correctly. Somebody told me there are 2 ways to pronounce the city of Louisville. To me, I feel I'm pilgrim, actually. I came here as a pilgrim. And I feel I'm on a pilgrimage. So every time when I come to the city, I feel I'm visiting a holy city. And always want to visit and walk on the 4th Street because Thomas Merton had an epiphany, I think, where he saw there's something amazing about humanity. And we can call it Buddha-ness or the unborn Buddha that lies in each of us. So anyway, the Shakyamuni Buddha is a historical Buddha who was awakened to his own Buddha nature. And not only that, who embodied and that awakening in everyday life. But we also take refuge in Shakyamuni Buddha, not as a personal liberator, but as a guide, as a source of inspiration. To do that, it requires some kind of connection or affinity with the Shakyamuni Buddha. In the same way, Christians feel a deep affinity and even divine love towards Jesus. In the same way, in Buddhism, also we try to cultivate this connection and deep affinity with the Shakyamuni Buddha, so that affinity can motivate oneself to enter the path of Dharma, the path to enlightenment, and not only that, to embody all these enlightened principles of the Buddhism, as well as also the Shakyamuni Buddha's attributes. So therefore, in Buddhism, we tell lots of stories about Shakyamuni Buddha, and also the Jataka stories, which are stories of the bodhisattvas. And some of them are wonderful stories because in those Jataka stories, characters are not always human beings. Sometimes animals, like, for example, rabbits, monkeys, elephant, and so forth. It's very entertaining when you listen to Jataka stories. But all the stories have a moral. They teach us how to be selfless, courageous, and compassionate. So when you hear the stories of Shakyamuni Buddha, such as 12 great deeds of a Buddha, you begin to feel this affinity with the Shakyamuni Buddha. And you feel that you're connecting with I guess, is it done? Yes? Oh, okay. I thought it was a signal that I should end my... Yeah, you really feel this deep connection with the Shakyamuni Buddha. And to the extent that you want to follow his path and you want to become like Shakyamuni Buddha. So to become Shakyamuni Buddha, or to become like Shakyamuni Buddha, is actually to become who you are, to become yourself. But you see there's this kind of interesting logic in that. First, we developed this longing to almost not mimic, but to almost like follow or try to become like Shakyamuni Buddha. But that whole journey of trying to become like Shakyamuni Buddha lead you to the actualization of yourself. And in the end, you become who you are. You actualize your true nature, which we call the unborn Buddha, or the inherent goodness. And so stories plays very important roles in the Buddhist practice. And then there are a lot of amazing stories that we could talk, but also many of the stories are actually illustrated in the sacred paintings known as tankas. When you visit Tibetan homes, monasteries, and temples, often they are filled with lots of tankas. And tankas are images of bodhisattvas, Buddhas, Uchta Devatas, and also stories like life story of Shakyamuni Buddha. And when you look at those tankas, sacred paintings, they actually speak story without words. They communicate with you, and they invoke, again, there's a sacred intention to follow the path of Shakyamuni Buddha. And so there are many ways of telling stories in Buddhism through words, art, poem, chant, and sometimes even you could say mudras, sacred gestures. And therefore, story is a very much integral part of the whole tradition in Buddhism, especially in Tibetan Buddhism. And also, we all have stories to share with each other too. Like we all have a personal anecdote that we can share, and that also inspire other people as well. I was planning to tell a Buddhist story right now, but I don't know whether I have enough time or not. Perhaps not. We got only 10 minutes, right?
I think we would love to hear it.
All right. So, well, now it's all gone from my mind. Hopefully it will come back. I remember it now. It's the same story I told, I think, at this very place many years ago. So please give me permission to tell the same story. Hopefully most of you are not here, and so you would not hear the same story. But remember, I'm from culture where people can listen to the same story 300 times a year, or maybe more than that. So stories about Avalokiteshvara, please don't take it literally. Avalokiteshvara is a bodhisattva, and bodhisattva is a being that could be an archetypal being, but also can be human being. We could be bodhisattvas, or we can become bodhisattvas. Bodhisattva means awakened heroine, awakened hero, whose sole spiritual practice is not to seek peace or transcendence for herself or for himself, but to be in this world, which is very messy. Human world is very messy. Well, there are a lot of good things in human world: candles, chocolate, right, ice cream, and good jokes. But overall, it's very messy too. It's very difficult to be human. I'm sure you all related to this idea that there are moments we feel it's really hard to be human being when life is filled with tragedies and suffering. When we see world is descending into chaoses, and we don't know what is waiting for us or for the humanity. So it's very messy sometimes, this human world. But the story, the bodhisattva is this ideal that you would never give up your aspiration. You continue to love this life and love this world, and to seek the enlightenment, transcendence, not in a heaven, not in a light, but in confusion, in suffering, in messiness. You'll find purity not in the purity, but in the messiness. And that is the idea of bodhisattva, often represented by lotus blossoming beautifully in mud. Lotus would not blossom on the beautiful rocks like marbles or gold, but blossoms in mud. The lotus symbolizes our courage, our enlightenment, and mud symbolizes the messiness of this human world. So this story is about Avalokiteshvara, Bodhisattva. Chinese call Kuan, Tibetans call Shandyazak, in Sanskrit Avalokiteshvara. The story begins that Avalokiteshvara wants to liberate, wants to enlighten everyone in the world, and she or he wants to take everyone to some kind of suffering-free Buddha realm. And he or she made a vow to do that. So she came to the world, and he or she awakened all beings, enlightened everyone, and he or she, it's hard to use the pronouns, but Avalokiteshvara took everyone, all beings from the world, to some kind of wonderful Buddha realm, and the world was empty. And then Avalokiteshvara told to herself or himself, that's tricky, and now I can retire forever, eternally, because the world is empty. And Avalokiteshvara was ready to retire eternally, and when Avalokiteshvara looked down, the world is filled with all these confused souls. And Avalokiteshvara come back, emptied world, and just help everybody to move or migrate to some kind of wonderful Buddha field. And Avalokiteshvara did that 6 times. Every time when world is empty, everybody moved away, the world is again filled with all these confused souls. In that moment, Avalokiteshvara lost his or her vow to awaken everybody, and told himself or herself, I'm going to give up, I'm going to retire, basically. And power of breaking Avalokiteshvara precept, she or he body fell into pieces. And Avalokiteshvara was in this painful experience, just agony, pain from losing the precepts, and the body being just fell apart into pieces. And there was an agony. In that moment, Buddha Amitabha, Buddha of infinite light, showed up and blessed Avalokiteshvara into a 4-armed Avalokiteshvara, 1,000-armed Avalokiteshvara, and 1,000-eyed Avalokiteshvara. Today, you'll actually see in the Tibetan paintings all these different forms of Avalokiteshvara. Some of them have 4 arms, some of them have 1,000 and 1,000 eyes. And then Avalokiteshvara arose again from that agony, just like Phoenix rose from the ash, and vowed to never give up the intention to help everyone in the world. And so we can take this wonderful story, and we can be like Avalokiteshvara. We can be not the Avalokiteshvara who is seeking eternal early retirement, if I can say that, but Avalokiteshvara who has 1,000 arms, who has 1,000 eyes, and who is willing to be in this world and to love this world, and to take all our challenges, tragedies, not as a defeat, but as a source of growth, courage, and spiritual as well as also personal development. Thank you very much, everybody.
Wonderful, thank you. Our final speaker, Rabbi Shmuley Yanklowitz, has twice, not once, but twice been named one of America's top rabbis by Newsweek magazine, and has been named by the Forward as one of the 50 most influential Jews and one of the most inspiring rabbis in America. Rabbi Yanklowitz is the author of 22 books, and I'm not going to read the titles, on Jewish ethics, and his writings have appeared in outlets including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Guardian, and the Atlantic, among many other publications. He has served as speaker at the World Economic Forum in Switzerland and a Rothschild Fellow in Cambridge in the UK. Rabbi Yanklowitz received a master's degree from Harvard University and also Yeshiva University, and his doctorate from Columbia University. And he was ordained as a rabbi along with 2 other private ordinations in Israel. He currently serves as the director of 4 nonprofits, including he is president and dean of a Learning in Action Center, VBM it is called, in Phoenix, Arizona. Please join me in welcoming Rabbi Yanklowitz.
Wow, it has been great to learn from these 3 amazing scholars and to be in this wonderful city that many of you live in, and to be with this top-notch team organizing this Festival of Faiths, who it's been just such a delight to experience the thoughtfulness and sensitivity put into all dimensions of the program. And there's an old Yiddish joke that before I speak, I'd like to say something, and that is that that my bio is not my story, and that ought to be obvious to us. But I want to address that particular to the younger folks in the room, to remember that our bios are not our stories, our Twitter feeds or Snapchats. These are not our stories. Our external images are very different and can become confusing from actually our deeper sense of being, our deeper sense of purpose in the world. David Brooks famously wrote about in his book on character that we have to learn to distinguish between our resume virtues and our eulogy virtues, right? So many of us today pursue our resume virtues. What can I put on in my public story to help me advance? But actually, what are the points I would want told about me at the end of my life? And how do we spend more time pursuing our eulogy virtues than our resume virtues? And trust that our career and success will flow from there. Jewish stories in their prime are actually not found in words, but in wordless melodies, what's known as the nigun. Today is Kristallnacht, and Kristallnacht was when the Nazi Germans started to burn all the synagogues and burn down all the Jewish businesses and lead pogroms in Germany on this day in 1939. And so, to anyone who's never heard this part of a nigun, it would sound just like a nai-nai. But to anyone whose family experienced this nigun is a story. Hanai, nanai, nai, nai. Nanai, nanai, nai, nai. And that melody goes on for about 5 minutes through a flow of rhythms. And then that melody actually ends with Jews finding refuge in Israel in 1948. And that melody continues, hi, nai, na, na, nai, na, na, nai, nai, na, na, nai. And it continues in a more hopeful rhythm. And it's actually these melodies, more than any words of stories that are told, that kind of shaped the Jewish psyche and soul through sacred storytelling. Melodies that bind us together. And of course, I shared already so much. As humans, we understand our stories, our lives, our purpose through these stories, how they shape us. And the challenge now as has been discussed, is refashioning ourselves through our stories and refashioning our stories through ourselves. And the threat to humanity, I believe, is to tell the old stories without questions, without adaptations. If the story isn't questioned, rethought, recontextualized for progress and understandings, it can harm. The only choices are not maintain the perfect purity of the story or abandon the story. And to give just two examples where it's so pertinent among so many others, the first is our understanding of humanity in relationship to the natural world. If I look at the Garden of Eden story, I can read that as a sense of dominance. I can do whatever I want to the earth. I can eat any animal I want. Everything is here for me in an anthropocentric worldview. Or I can re-understand that story in light of climate change, in light of the tens of billions of animals slaughtered in factory farming. If I look at the relationship of women in society, and I look to those stories, I could read once again the Garden of Eden as a prescriptive verse, man shall dominate woman. Or I can read that as a descriptive rather than prescriptive verse, that this is what is happening unless we reverse that curse. And of course, there are so many others like that. And so I want to offer just a snapshot of a Jewish epistemic approach to pluralism, which is a variety of ideas that must lead us to difference, disagreement, and adaptation. Now, I want to be clear here that by pluralism, I don't mean a relativism where all sides of an argument are equally valid and we abandon our cherished absolutes, but rather where we learn how to hold on to our absolutes, but give space for each other's absolutes. America's learning to do this. Democracy is about supporting a process even if you don't like the conclusion. How do we create a space of pluralism where we hold our absolutes and fight for them while creating space for others as well, even when we might find them false or despicable? Now, the story of Judaism, of course, starts with the birth of biblical monotheism, and to some degree, biblical absolutism. But it's a misunderstanding of the Jews to describe them as a people of the book. Because while it is to some degree true that that is the Hebrew scriptures, the Torah is the springboard for the religion and for the people, really I believe the essence of Judaism as we know it is to be rooted in Talmudic pluralism. And this pluralism is built so deeply into Judaism in an anti-proselytizing ethos, in a sense that there's not one truth we ultimately want to get to. Elie Wiesel famously said, the goal of Judaism was never to make the world more Jewish, but to make the world more human. And so I want to look at just these two figures who are the towers of the birth of the Talmud, starting with the Mishnah and then moving into the Gemara, and Hillel and Shammai, and how they understood this process of conflicting values, conflicting stories, conflicting narratives. It says over here, hopefully you can read that. Rabbi Abba said that Shmuel said, my name is Shmuli, named after Shmuel, also as Samuel, the book of Samuel, his name is Shmuel in the Hebrew scriptures. For 3 years, Beit Shammai, meaning the house of Shammai, the school of thought, and Beit Hillel, they disagreed. These ones said the halakha, the Jewish law, is in accordance with our opinion. And these said the halakha is in accordance with our opinion. They disagreed, right? 50-50 down the line, like the election results, right? Ultimately, a divine voice emerged and proclaimed, both these and those are the words of the living God. Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim. What? Both sides are the voice of God? However, the halakha is in accordance with the opinion of Beit Hillel. The Gemara asks, since both these and those are the words of the living God, why were Beit Hillel privileged to have the halakha established in accordance with their opinion? Get it? So there's a disagreement, and God says, they're both true, right? These are both true, and yet we're going to side with this one. So if they're both true, why do we have to side with one over the other? The Talmud concludes, because they were kindly and modest, they studied their own rulings and those of the opposing camp, and were even so humble to teach the actions of Beit Shammai before theirs. They preserved the opposing opinion and taught the opposing opinion, and even taught it before theirs. And so this is the birth of machloket, the Talmudic discourse of disagreement, and the understanding that values are weak. Values are weak if they're absolute. But values in dialectical tension with other values are very strong. Stories are weak, but stories in dialectical tension with competing stories, with competing narratives, are enduring. And so how does this lead us in this conversation around pluralism and particularism versus universalism? It goes over here around the issue of conversion. The Gentile said, this non-Jewish person said, "These garments, for whom are they designated?" The student said to him, "For the high priest, the Kohen Gadol." The Gentile said to himself, "I will go and convert, so they will install me as the high priest." He came before Shammai and said, "Convert me on condition you install me as a high priest." Shammai pushed him away with a cubit in his hand. So then he goes before Hillel, the other camp, and he automatically converted him. We know today that there are those who believe there ought to be exclusivity in faiths. Think about how it's been politicized in ways we might like or not like in the name of the integrity of our faith. Think about the idea of President Biden being denied communion because of his stand on abortion. Think about the idea of President Trump being told he's not a Christian, by the Pope due to his stance on poverty, right? The idea that actually you're not a part of us based upon your view. I want to push you away and reject you and your views, and you're not welcome in this space. But then think of the side of inclusivity, the side of Hillel as opposed to Shammai, that our story is about all of us together, those we like and those we don't like yet. That we ultimately are working to live by an elevated spiritual consciousness. All are one in this interconnected space of souls, those we agree with and those we don't agree with. And so I'm going to show you this third source here to take something very loaded in America as well. This last debate between Hillel and Shammai, although there's dozens of them, coming from the Mishnah of Gittin. Now, the rabbis didn't like the ancient world's notion of slavery, but as a reminder, this is 2,000 years ago. This is not 19th century abolitionists. 2,000 years ago, they're wrestling with this. And here they're dealing with a half-slave. What do we do with this half-slave, one who's born from a free person and a person who is a slave? And it says, one who is a half-slave and half-free, he serves his master one day and then himself one day. That's the words of Beit Hillel, right? He should break up his days. He's half and half. Beit Shammai said, you set it right for his master, but for himself you didn't set it right. To marry a maidservant isn't possible because half of him is free, right? He can't marry anyone. To marry a free woman isn't possible because half of him is slave. So would you cancel his obligation to reproduce? But isn't it true that the world wasn't created except for bearing fruit and reproducing, as it says in Isaiah? Not to be waste did God create her, the earth. To be settled upon her did God form her. Rather, because of setting the world right, mipnei tikkun olam, repairing the world, they force his master, who must make him a free person, and write a contract for him to redeem the remaining half of his value. And Beit Hillel turned to teach according to the words of Beit Shammai. Now that's a fascinating conclusion, mainly because Hillel is normally the authoritative view, and Shammai is who's more of an exclusivist than an inclusivist, more of a particularist than a universalist, is pushed down. But here Shammai wins, and I don't know if you've ever seen on the Twitter feed an argument that ends in, you know what, I thought about your view and you're right. But that's the conclusion here in the Talmud. They disagree on what to do with the half-slave. And Hillel says, you know what, you're right. That half-slave should be liberated, should be freed. And Shammai convinces Hillel that debate actually can be fruitful, and there is too much at stake to not talk. I'll close with this short story. How many of y'all have seen the movie The 10 Commandments? Maybe you were like me as a kid, you were forced to watch this every 3 months, right? The great Charlton Heston, the founder of the NRA, is there as Moshe Rabbeinu, as Moses, and he raises up his staff, and if you look really closely, you can see his Rolex watch popping out, right? The great Moses, right? But back in those days, they couldn't Photoshop it, and there were like thousands crossing through the sea, so they couldn't redo the scene or anything, right? But in that moment, how do they show it? They show one pathway where all the Israelites are walking through, where the sea has been split. But in fact, the Midrash, the Talmudic commentary on that story that reframes it, says, actually, there's not one pathway through the sea, but 12. And there were chomot v'chomot, walls and walls of water between those 12 pathways, right? But there were not only walls of water, there were chalonot v'chalonot, windows and windows between the water. Right? What a cool scene, right? There's these 12 pathways, everyone's marching through with their matzah, and they're looking through, and they can see through these walls of water, these windows. And I think what the rabbis are teaching there is, each of us has our own pathway towards liberation. Whatever our faith or ideology or narrative is, whatever our stories are, we have to walk on our authentic path, not someone else's path. But we need windows to see each other. And that is what is going to get us to a place of liberation, that for us to tell our own stories, listen to each other's stories through those, and see them through those windows, right? And giving dignity to each other's stories while reaffirming the authenticity of our own paths. Thank you so much.
Okay, I hope like me, you're looking forward to the conversation afterwards. We're going to have a short musical interlude during which we can reflect on this conversation.
Sometimes it's hard to breathe when we do what must be done to keep our lives in order and to have a little fun. We've got love for our oppressors, for every man and child. I can do it. I can make it for a while. If we can recall that everyone brings her story on her shoulder, and never means to harm us when her shrieks are cold and colder. Someone made her taste his boot and wallow in his bile. I can do it. I can make it for a while. And then if we can sing something, making her horizons brighter, give her rousing verse and melody to uplift and delight her, and recognize this power that's the spirit and the style, we can do it. We can make it for a while. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Hope forever as false promise, faith forever stands alone. If in her shoes we'll take that step, that proverbial hard mile, we can do it. We can make it for a while.
And in this part of the program, we're gonna sort of talk about what we heard in the first hour. And we've gotten a couple of questions already from our students. And we were talking about it behind the scenes before we came out. They're actually tough questions that you all put to us, but I thought they would be a good way to start. So the first question we got was to each of us, which is, what story from your faith tradition means the most to you, and why?
Oh, I guess I will begin. I will be happy to do that. Well, the night before Dr. King was assassinated, he preached in a Pentecostal church, Mason Temple, Church of God in Christ. And he wasn't even supposed to speak that night. He wasn't feeling well. But Ralph Abernathy recounts he shows up and his spirits are up for some reason. And that night he gave his famous I've been to the mountaintop speech. Mm-hmm. And the speech is an allusion to the story of Moses, who was not allowed to go into the promised land. but he was able to look into it and to see that his great work and all his sacrifices are going to pay off for the children of Israel. And I love that story because, in a sense, you can hear in Dr. King's speech that he knew he was going to die. It's incredibly powerful. He knew he was going to die. That by this time on tomorrow, he would be dead. But he had such hope and peace and joy in that moment, and that story means a lot to me because, in a sense, it demonstrates his experience of solidarity with Moses. That, in a sense, the work that he was doing for the black community is very similar, that here's a leader that's not going to be able to benefit from the fruits of his labor, but it is going to be a blessing to his people. And so not only does it show solidarity, but I think it just provides meaning, hope, and strength to stand up in the moment and to say, I'm not afraid, I'm not fearing anyone, for mine eyes have seen the glory of the Lord. And I mean, it's a powerful speech. So that story means a lot to me because when we read stories, we can do so in a way that shows solidarity to those who have gone on before us, and it just provides a window for hope, meaning, and strength for today.
I think that's a wonderful example because, in a way, the interaction between the past and the present, or Dr. King's present, it's sort of interacting, right? I mean, when I read that speech, it also sheds light on Moses to me. I see, the struggle that Moses had with his own self, knowing that he wasn't going to make it into the promised land, and to have Dr. King inhabit that story brings it alive. Yeah.
I'd like to just respond to that before I share mine, if I may.
Yes.
Thank you. So, I'm very moved by that, and I've always been very moved by that Moses isn't buried by the people. The Talmud says that God buries him. We don't know where he's buried even. And in the Passover Seder, the Haggadah, the book we read, we don't talk about him. It's not about him. And it's not about Dr. King. With all my love for Dr. King, my firstborn son, his Hebrew name is Meir Lev Cook, so he has the initials MLK, right? I love the man, but it's not about him, and it's not about Moses, right? And that's what's the power of the story. It's kept alive. The contemporary moral challenges are alive because we don't seal it away into that one person. So I love that parallel between the two, and actually how each of us thinks of ourselves continuing their work. So as I shared earlier, I find the power of stories not in the story itself, but in the tension between stories. And I'll give just two snapshots of that. One is the amazing story of Abraham about to sacrifice his son Isaac. And he doesn't argue with God at all. Now that's incredibly strange because just before that, we learn that God is going to destroy Sodom. And what does Abraham do? He challenges a whole lot. What if there's 50 righteous, 40 righteous, 30 righteous? He's going to challenge God all the way to the end. Can the God of justice is going to do this, right? Such a horrible thing. And so how can right after that story, God say, kill your son? He says, okay. Right? Doesn't even challenge, right? So actually we have to read those two stories in tension with each other. And I'm not going to give the answer on how I do that. But okay, fine, I will. So I think Abraham misinterpreted the conclusion that he thinks God wins. Oh, what do I know? God knows everything. I know nothing. If God said this is all wicked people that should be destroyed, I shouldn't have protested. So now you tell me kill my son? Well, you know everything. I don't know anything. I shouldn't protest. But he misinterpreted the conclusion there. And actually, we do have to challenge. We do have to bring voices of protest within our faiths and beyond our faiths. The other story of tension I want to show is between the flood and the Tower of Babel, which is the same parsha, the same container of actually in the Jewish community we just read that together. And after the flood happens because of chaos, there is no order, there is no collectivity. But the end of the flood is the Tower of Babel, which is the opposite problem, not of no collectivity, but radical collectivity. And so what's the sin of the Tower of Babel? One view might be, geez, all of humanity unites and all you can do is build a tower? right? You couldn't build a hospital, you couldn't build a school, right? You couldn't build a festival of faiths for humanity, right? That's all you got is a tower, right? But the other way to read it is, what does it say? All humanity spoke in one voice. One voice. And that is the greatest sin. A unity without diversity. That ultimately we need to figure out, and that's when 70 nations are created, 70 languages, figure out how we can have a unity that deeply embraces the dignity and value of difference within that unity.
Wow.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
What to say? But I hear a little bit, not enough. Wonderful stories from Bible and also the life story of Jesus Christ. Many Buddhists actually hold Jesus Christ in very high regard, and his stories are in very much harmony with the stories of bodhisattvas. It's about love, forgiveness, compassion. Also in Buddhism, we do have love stories. Did I say love stories? Yes, we have love stories, but lots of stories too. But even the story of Buddha is not always same. The Theravadan Buddhists have their own version of a Buddha story, and then Mahayana Buddhists have their own version of a Buddha story, the story of the same Buddha. So which tells us that these stories are needed to have inspiration, moral guideline, and also hold the kind of philosophical system of your own path. But also tells us that we should not get attached to stories. Even in Buddhism, there are almost two conflicting stories about the same Buddha. I think reminding us that yes, we should use those stories, but do not get attached to stories. Because if you get attached to the stories, then there's a danger that we become very dogmatic, and we don't basically listen to the voice of others, their stories. We don't appreciate their stories. We have tendency to demand everybody to believe that my version of stories are the correct, and we try sometimes, unfortunately, force others to adapt my stories. So I think it's good to remember that to use those stories, but not to get too much attached to them, because stories are stories, right? That's why they're called the stories.
Can I jump in?
Yes, please. Absolutely.
Well, but that's what's so instructive about the moment that we find ourselves in. That to go back and use the story of the Tower of Babel, that metaphor, that very much describes what white Americans have done in history, have tried to build this country, with this sort of vision of a monolith that has done such damage, whether it's the genocide of Native Americans, the enslavement of African Americans. And today what you have is voices from the margin trying to be heard so that there is a diversity amongst unity. So this is one of the reasons I'm always honored to be a part of this gathering and this festival, because it's really modeling for the nation how we can live into a healthy future where we can all thrive, where all our stories can be told. And so how do we amplify and magnify platforms to do that is really my passion. And so both of your comments just caught it struck a nerve that very much symbolizes both the history and this moment that we're in.
Yeah, I think that's very important. And I think Rabbi Yanklowitz brought up a fabulous example of how bringing minority voices or marginal voices to the center is actually an ancient tradition. This is not something that we just happened upon, you know, in the last few years. There is something about sacred storytelling that is constantly negotiating with the margins. And in fact, some of our most powerful myths come from the margins. They don't come from the center or those in power. And we can all think of examples of that in our own traditions. I actually have another question before we get to the second audience question, which is sort of implicit in a lot of what you're talking about, which is, can you talk about how sacred stories should be read? I think there's this notion, particularly in the modern West, that you should go to the bookstore, buy yourself a Bible in whatever form, or you know, the Life of the Buddha, and just go home and read it on your own. Can you talk a little bit about the role of community in shaping how we read and what we take from sacred stories?
Rabbi, I'm going to let you begin.
Okay, great. You know, I used to believe, I lived on a hilltop in a caravan in Israel for 2 years, day and night just studying. And I believed at the time, the more I studied, the better of a person I'd be. Like the more scriptures you got into your head, the more you learned. And I started to realize you can learn the wrong way. You can learn in ways that make you a worse person. And that ought to be obvious to us, but I didn't get that. That we have to bring our moral intuition to these stories. And I think part of the ways that we do it in the Jewish community is we learn in chavruta, in study partner. You don't sit alone and read your book. If you walk into a yeshiva, a Jewish learning center, it is set up in pairs. The whole room will be hundreds of people with pairs across from each other, arguing. It's the opposite of a quiet library. It's screaming. People standing up, arguing with each other. You think they're enemies, you know, and then they go get lunch and they're best friends, right? But it happens in that dialectical, engagement, the dialogical, in which Buber moves beyond the text into the face-to-face encounter. And Emmanuel Levinas has a lot to say about this in terms of ethics today. And so I think this notion that these stories have to be engaged in a dialogue fashion rather than in a solitary fashion. So that's the first thing I'll say. The second thing I'll say is the humility that in pre-modernity, we sort of thought we had access to objective truth. And then, comes Kant and the like. And we started to realize that all objective data passes through the subjectivity of the mind. And then we understood in developmental psychology that we don't hold on to memory. Right? Memory is constantly reconstructed. And so we actually talk more about memory than about stories in the Jewish community. And with a humility that memory is constantly reconstructed and re-understood, and requires a collective of voices to actually get to the heart of what it is we're trying to share.
And I'll add that people have been reading sacred texts for hundreds, thousands of years. So you're not the first person to read and appropriate meaning. And so you read in one point on a long continuum. And it's so important to have some awareness of the ways, emphasis on ways, as in plural, the ways passages and stories have been read, interpreted, and used so that you are making informed and responsible appropriations today. I mean, God forbid we keep repeating some of the mistakes. There are also tremendous gifts from stories and how other traditions and other people have read those in different eras that can be, sources of just such hope and strength and meaning today. And so just to think, hey, I'm going to go grab this book, it's just going to be me by myself. Number one, you can't even read this without a community of people who are willing to compile these things, translate them for you. So you're a part of a gathering, a collection of readers and interpreters.
Thank you, both of you. Yeah, I agree with both of you. It's not like that after this morning we all go out and start purchasing books on stories, sacred stories. We learn stories from conversations, from running into books, from maybe attending talks like this. Today I learned very valuable stories from both of you, and I would contemplate them. Thank you for giving these wonderful sacred stories. But stories, when we read them, we kind of have to know that stories are, of course, usually based on our memories, and our memories are constantly changing, and also the whole narrative is constantly changing as time goes by. So we maybe have to use some kind of discernment to get the moral, the essential wisdom of the story, and not try to take everything literally. And then I think you can enjoy almost any story. Even though I call myself Buddhist, I love to read books from other traditions. Some of my favorite poets are not Buddhist, actually. And Thomas Merton, I loved his books. When I was trying to learn English, one of the first books I picked up was Thomas Merton's books, and I really enjoy reading his books. So I learned lots of stories from not just my own tradition, but from different traditions. And I think if you use discernment, you can always get wisdom from almost every sacred stories, regardless of their tradition.
Can I add one more thing?
Please.
The community of readers and interpreters, it's so important because you read from a particular historical, social, and cultural standpoint. And so we often read ourselves into stories and into text. But people who have a different social location can see things in the text that we don't see. So when you are open to listening to the stories of others coming from different locations, they'll actually give you a vantage point or an angle or a truth in a story that you otherwise could not see. So I talk about this in my upcoming book in a chapter called Collateral Damage in the Bible. And I talk about the importance of paying attention to silent characters, people in biblical stories that we completely ignore, like the baby born of the rape of David when he took Uriah's wife Bathsheba, raped her, and the child that was the product of that rape in a form of judgment. God's like, this baby's gonna die. The baby didn't do anything wrong to justify that. And so I talk about how it's important to pay attention to those characters and to explore issues of meaning for these characters and not just the main characters. Why am I even sensitive to that? Well, some of that is because of my social location. I know what it is like to have to suffer in silence. And so listening to interpreters from places beyond where you are will always open your eyes in exciting ways.
I mean, it's one of the reasons that I love to teach, because I get to be with my stories, which are the stories of the Hebrew Bible, and every time there's a student who looks me in the eye and tells me something about this text, this story, that I did not notice. I've assigned it, 25 years running, and I'm hearing about it as if it's new again. And that's what makes sacred stories vibrant, alive, right? That's what gives them new life, is the kind of communal exercise of interpretation. Wonderful. Rinpoche, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot, you had a very vivid example, and I'm sure many of us share in it, of your grandparents telling you some of the sacred stories, also some of the ghost stories, but the stories of this world, but also the sacred stories. And I'm wondering if you all could reflect a little bit on how we get our stories, how we receive them from teachers, from ancestors, from grandparents. I'm interested in the personal relay of the sacred stories.
You're up.
You're up. I put you on the spot.
Okay, thank you for letting me know that. Yeah. I think there's many sources of all these sacred stories. I noticed that in Christian and the Jewish sermons, there are a lot of stories. And Buddhism, we tell stories here and there, but it's not like the main part of the lectures or teachings. There's kind of new growing movement in the Buddhist communities where people really like to hear stories, like sacred stories, personal stories, anecdotes, and so forth. But when I listened to stories when I was young, there were many kind of entertainment, and some of them have morals, but then now I actually revisit all the stories again, and they have much more meaning to me. And some of the stories are personal anecdotes, which is more like convincing, and some of them are regarded as maybe fairy tales, and maybe fables, and so forth. But even they're old, I think if you interpret them with the right understanding, they all have so much meaning, and they can be some kind of sacred compass to guide us, because stories are often about being on journey, and life is a journey, and they invite us to be the heroines and heroes on this journey. And sometimes it's not easy to be heroine, right, on this journey, or hero when life is very complicated. So the stories often give us a kind of empowerment or courage to continue this journey. Lots of the stories that I hear from Buddhism is all about being courageous on this journey. And also they always warn you that the journey is going to be tough and difficult. There will be storms and confusions and challenges, tragedies. But if you don't give up, if you continue this journey as a heroine or hero, in the end you're going to find liberation. Not only that, you'll be a source of goodness to your community, to your family, to the world. So in that sense, I would say all the sacred stories are happy ending or holy ending, something like that. It shows us a destination where we can be great. So maybe we can say, they are holy ending.
Holy ending, I like that. Yeah.
Not so much happy ending.
Yeah.
Well, there's this concept in biblical studies, we call it the canon within the canon. So in the Protestant Bible, there's 66 books, 66 separate writings. And conservative Christians always, all of it's the Word of God. Do you read it all? No, they don't. But it's all the Word of God to them. But what happens in families and churches is there is a focus on certain stories, certain writings that just over time mean a lot. It sort of symbolizes when when you look at the whole history of how we come up with the canon of scriptures, some writings just stand the test of time, and people just keep going back to them. And so growing up in church, there are just certain stories, verses in the Bible that you just keep hearing over and over again. And so when you think about what has been passed down, I just think of this image of my mother sitting on her, always sitting in the living room with her Bible open, reading in the book of Romans. That's probably her favorite book of the Bible, and she's been preaching for over 50 years. And so I grew up with this image of her with the text open, always reading and studying. And so when I think about writings in the Bible that mean a lot to me, a lot of that is being a product of this community of interpreters who says, this verse means a lot to us, this verse gives us meaning, this verse helps us to understand who God is for us. And so I'd just like to share that.
I was so engaged with these great answers, I forgot the question.
So the question is, where do we find our stories? What the sort of the personal dimension of how they're passed on to us, either by grandparents or by mothers or by the selection of certain stories within the canon?
So, wow. So I grew up in an interfaith home. My father is Jewish, and my mother is an evangelical Christian.
So you've got a story.
And like every dinner table was a festival of faith. You know? Anybody could come. You're all welcome to the table. And you know, like religion divides in society, so too religion divided. And when I chose at 10 to pursue the Jewish path, you know, there was hurt involved in that. I mean, they gave me the choice. We'll have access to both. But it turns out now, decades later from that choice, my mother and I are study partners. And she, as someone who has stage 4 cancer and is a very, very frail, and brings a deeply religious Christian read to the text, we read the book of Psalms together. And what emerges from that is not Christian-Jewish dialogue. What emerges for that is deeply vulnerable, deeply human, deeply spiritual reads of text between a mother and a son. And I couldn't, as a child, hear her, what she wanted to offer me, for various reasons why kids can't hear their parents. Because, you know, a religious teaching sounds the same as go clean your room. And so we want to push back against these things. But now I can hear her so deeply. I can hear her so deeply, and I very much cherish that gift. And I document, I write down, you know, everything she shares in our sessions together. And I think that sometimes we think about community, but sometimes some of those relationships that are most important to us, having hard conversations can be achieved through looking at stories rather than looking just at those conversations and allowing those conversations to emerge from those stories.
That's beautiful, wonderful. So Rinpoche, you said something that really landed with me. You said that stories have the power to make us like ourselves. Maybe our better selves, maybe not, but like ourselves. And I wonder, I would love to hear about that from each of your perspective. How is it that sacred stories make us like ourselves?
What way do we mean like there?
Oh,
Do you mean like I like me? Like
no,
I look in the mirror
no,
and I like me?
no, I don't mean it that way. I mean they make us into ourselves.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, good, thank you for that's a good clarification. And I wonder, I would love to hear more about that from you, Rinpoche, but I'd also love to hear from our other panelists if that resonates, if that lands the way that it did for me. Do you want to start us off, since it was your brilliance?
Okay, you invite me to be the first, okay? Yeah, today I'm sitting here, and we have a role, doctor, rabbi, right? And my role is perhaps the Tibetan word would be lama. I do have a very funny story about that, but maybe another time. So you could say my role is lama. Why I end up being lama, whatever that means in this life, it has to do with the stories. Of course, I will be a Buddhist since I'm a Tibetan person. Most Tibetan people are Buddhist, but I may not be sitting here playing this role as Lama. I could be anywhere. I could be in Tibet right now, maybe being a yak herder, most probably, herding yaks in the mountains. It's a very nice lifestyle. I become Lama mainly while growing up with my grandparents. They told me lots of stories. They're very simple-minded people. They're not really literate. My grandfather read a little, but not so much. They're Buddhist, very much devout Buddhist, but they did two things: chanting Buddhist prayers and telling Buddhist stories. No doctrine, no Buddhist doctrine, because they're not educated. You kind of have to be a little bit educated to know all these Buddhist doctrines. So they never really told me any Buddhist doctrines. I had to learn the Buddhist doctrines much later through some kind of formal training. But they always chanted prayers every day, and they will be turning the prayer wheel and holding the mala, chanting, especially Nemo Avalokiteshvara, Om Mani Padme Hum all the time. And they told me lots of Buddhist stories, which inspired me to not just become Buddhist, but to take the path as my life's vocation. So, which led me to dedicate my life to this path, and that's why I'm here. So, in that sense, these stories actually changed my life and gave me a whole path. So they are very powerful in that sense.
That's fascinating, that the power of sacred story to shape the self in a way that doctrine doesn't.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Do you,
Well, there's the story of me and there's the story of we, and it's interesting. If we're all going to die, right? I hope I didn't just break some news to everyone, but we're all going to die. And for most of us, that actually adds more meaning to our lives rather than less, the fact that we're mortal. But if I told you that in 30 years from our death, all of humanity was going to die, that would actually, I think, for most of us, remove all meaning from our lives. Like, what is this about? And we sometimes think of ourselves as individualistic and selfish. But I think actually we are very collectivist in our nature. The fact that we're going to die, we're okay with. The fact that all humanity is not going to make it, we might, like we can't bear. We understand that the stories outlive us. And so how does my story exist inside a larger context of stories? And when I tell stories to my kids or in an educational context, I say, that's the mashal, that's the story. Now, what's the nimshal? What do you take from the story? Like, what are you going to live with there? And I think one of the things that took me a long time to realize was that some of our stories have overtaken our minds, stories about ourselves, that we have been told we're something throughout our lives. We're less valuable. We matter less. Or we are defined by that moment of a bad choice we made in our lives at some point, right? And we have a story about who we are. And ultimately, learning how to hold some stories more loosely in order to create more space for other stories as well. That's not only true on a global interfaith context, it's not only true on a human level of current and the future of humanity, but it's true of the self as well, that I am many things. And there's no story of my life that can ultimately define me.
There's a text out of James in the first chapter where it gives the exhortation to be hearers and doers of the word. As the passage goes on, it uses the analogy of hearing scripture in a way as similar to looking at your image in a mirror or in a glass. Stories provide powerful mirrors about humanity. Now, with two caveats. First, if we stop always putting ourselves in the hero, heroine spot and start maybe seeing ourselves as some of the, the people who aren't doing good things in these stories, and understanding that all texts are not prescriptive, some of them are just descriptive. I talk about this in my book about how there is a dark side to religion. And religious people have the capacity for such good, but also the capacity for indifference, hate, and evil, and to use God to justify those things. And so there are texts that seem problematic that are actually very, very instructive about our capacity to do those things to our neighbors. And so I love using stories and text as a mirror that gives us an opportunity to be honest about ourselves and to encourage us to be the best of ourselves and not the worst.
I love that. If I can just add one thing to
Please,
that.
yes.
This idea of owning our shadow side, the shadow side of religion and the shadow side of ourselves and our own complicity. That the famous verse in Leviticus, you shall love your fellow as yourself, is in Hebrew, ve'ahavta l'reyecha kamocha. You shall love your fellow. But actually, reyecha, which sounds like your fellow, can also be translated as from ra, which means evil. You shall love reyecha, your evil, as part of yourself, which is another way of interpreting. You have to, if you only see yourself or your religion as light, and you don't see the shadow side of that history and of our own complicity, and own that and love it as part of the full self, in the sense that I take responsibility for it, then we may have missed what the whole enterprise is.
That's tight, Doc. Yes. Yeah.
So in an interesting way, that actually leads into the second audience question that we got, which was, to you, from our students, to you, are sacred stories religious texts or personal narratives or both, and why?
Ooh-wee.
I know, I told you they ask hard questions. Are sacred stories religious texts or personal narratives or both, and why?
I'll be quick. I think in a way they could be both. I don't think that sacred stories, they can be sacred but not authoritative in the same way as a sacred text. But they do influence how we read the text. So it's kind of a both and. That is a great, great question, because we cannot read texts devoid of who we are and all that we bring to the text. So being aware of that and what's sacred about aspects of our experience and how they inform how we read text, it's all in that messy hermeneutical mush. So I would say yes to both of those questions.
I agree with you. They can be both. I don't think I also answered your question completely. The spiritual stories in Buddhism are sometimes literal, sometimes metaphorical. It's not like that we are trying to interpret them metaphorically. Actually, Buddhism already gave us a kind of authority to do that. Lots of sutras will say such stories, and then later the ancient commentators on the sutras will say this is not to be taken literally. But I think the heart of all the spiritual stories or sacred stories in Buddhism is about truly actualizing who we are. Even though there are narratives, there are language, there are whatever, rhythm are very different, but they all are pointing out to the same place. You can have many compass, but they're all pointing to the same place. And that lies within. Buddhism teaches that the most thing that we are worshipping, we may use that word, or that we are praying to, is called Dharmakaya, which is ineffable Buddha, unborn Buddha. And they always say, do not seek that unborn Buddha outside yourself, because that would be just the journey of confusion. But come back to yourself, and you'll find the ultimate truth, the absolute, the unborn Buddha within yourself. Your true nature is the unborn Buddha. So therefore, I feel that all the sacred stories in Buddhism actually are eventually teaching you how to become who you are, how to be awakened, or how to actualize your true nature. And that is already the unborn Buddha. In that sense, they all lead to the same place, and that place lies within each of us.
Wonderful. Thank you.
So I wonder how both of those types of stories can be windows to expansiveness. And to start with, how our sacred stories can expand us beyond our personal biases. So take the death penalty. I happen to be myself opposed to the death penalty because of racial injustices and racial biases and the high percentages of people who are innocently killed and put on death row. But take that case. If one's child was the murderer, they are likely to oppose the death penalty. And if one's child was, God forbid, the one who was killed, they're more likely to support it. But if we approach that issue of the death penalty through our sacred stories first and formulate our values without the personal biases of the emotional intensity of those traumas, we can transcend our personal stories and our personal biases to reach a place of justice, a place of collective ethics. And so those stories can be expansive beyond us. Now take the opposite, how our personal stories can be more expansive than a more narrow sacred story we've inherited. We all have people in our communities and stories that of supremacy, of Christian supremacy. This is the one true faith, everything else is lies. Jewish supremacy, everything else is lies. And relationships in our personal lives can help us to expand and challenge those notions. As I mentioned with my mother, like that learning with my mother is something that empowers me to push back at anything I hear in a Jewish space that makes it sound like, oh, any other faith that's really missed the mark. This is really the one that's got it right. I go, no. I know my mother. This is not just a personal love. That love and that dignity actually enables me to expand and challenge some of those sacred stories. So I think that the relationship between those two can both push us in different areas of expansiveness.
Wonderful. I think we have time for one more question, and it's a question in which I ask you to forecast. So, as you all know, the tradition of finding sacred stories in a book between two covers is actually fairly recent in human history, right? It's been oral for all of their existence, and there have been different media by which stories have been relayed, scrolls, so on and so forth. Where are we going to be finding our sacred stories in the years to come? What media? How are they going to be transmitted and relayed to a wider culture? We've talked about the importance of the personal, of grandparents. We've talked about the importance of the book. But what are the other forms in which we remake and retell our sacred stories for future audiences?
Welcome to one of my university favorite classes, where one of my favorite places to study religion and philosophy is TV and movies, film. We tell stories, and this is such a big part of our culture that really the Religious Academy is a little slow responding to. I think we will continue to tell stories about ourselves and the deep anxieties we have about the future in movies. So whether it's the zombie genre, that we're experimenting with things and we're going to unleash things on ourselves, I think it's important to pay attention to the stories that's coming out of the entertainment industry, because they are beyond just entertaining us. They're communicating some deeper things, and I think that's going to be something that's going to continue for quite some time. And I want to forecast that a future Festival of Faiths is going to be examining the role of religion in film and media down the road. So just since we're forecasting.
Well, I feel that part of the negative dimension of capitalism and of our current moment is how we allow the loudest voices to shape our collective story. Elon Musk cannot be our storyteller. And sometimes the social media feeds in these little snapshots where there can be a lot of truth, but they dominate our discourse and they dominate our sense of identity and the story of what's actually happening, those who have the bigger platforms. I want to push us to think about how we hear the still small voice in very humble, vulnerable spaces. How we listen to some of the most marginalized and those who are suffering most, and hear their stories in our own lives and allow them to shape us as well. I know I have a Japanese friend, he's about 75 years old, and he just goes hospice to hospice, holding the hands of the dying. And he has no social media platforms, he has no books, he has nowhere to tell his stories. But those are the stories he hears, the last words on people's lips. And I want those stories to shape us as well. It says in the Talmud, where will the Mashiach be found? Where will the Messiah be found? At the city gates, sitting among the sick and the homeless, wrapping bandages. And I think that the kinds of stories that I want to see us cultivate are from those spaces.
You get the last word.
Maybe no word, the last word. Yeah, I don't really have anything to say more than you both said it perfectly. Yeah, you're right. The social media is a very powerful medium, and if you tell story, it can reach out to so many people in instant, not just within your community, but to the other side of the world. So therefore, I feel that in some sense, we all have our own little platform, as long as we have a smartphone, which everybody does. So we all can be storytellers. The question is, what kind of a storyteller you want to be? You want to tell a story that would incite division, prejudice, cruelty, competition, greed, or you want to tell stories that invoke more a noble impulse in the people, an impulse like social activism, and our duty to, work for justice and peace, harmony, and saving the environment. So we are all storytellers. I think everybody has a following these days, right, in social media. So there are a lot of people who are listening to your stories, and therefore remember to be a sacred storyteller.
Wonderful. Thank you. Join me in thanking our panelists.